thank you for bearing with us. We wanted to get more folks onto the Facebook Live, so that's looking great, and we're excited about that, so thank you. So my name is Lara Riley. I'm the director of the Zimmerli Art Museum here and a professor of art history. And I want to thank you all for joining us. And as is typical at the Zimmerli, I want to start the evening by acknowledging the land on which we stand as the ancestral territory of the Lenape people. At the Zimmerli, we pay respect to Indigenous people throughout the Lenape diaspora and honor those who have been historically and systematically disenfranchised, including the three federally recognized nations in Oklahoma and Wisconsin, including the Delaware Tribe of Indians, the Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge-Munsee community. And we also acknowledge that Rutgers University, like New Jersey in general, was founded upon the exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. At the Zimmerli, we're deeply committed to amplifying the voices of Native American artists and curators, and through exhibitions, collaborations, and public programs like this, we strive to ensure that Indigenous perspectives are not only represented, but centered. Now, tonight we have the distinct pleasure of presenting a panel on curating Indigenous art in conjunction with the exhibition Indigenous Identities, Here Now and Always, curated by the late and great John Smith. Today's speakers, as I'm sure you all know, include some of the most esteemed curators working in the United States today: Lara Evans, Candice Hopkins, and Jami Powell, and we are deeply honored that they've decided to spend some time with us this evening. So let me run through their short bios, because I would be going on and on and on if we went through the really long ones, because they're so distinguished, as I'm sure many of you know. But I'll start with Dr. Lara Evans, is a scholar, curator, artist, and enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation. In 2023, Dr. Evans joined First Peoples Fund as Vice President of Programs after 18 years as an art history professor, most recently at the Institute of American Indian Art. Her curatorial projects include the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Shared Honors and Burdens, the Renwick Invitational of 2023, and the IAIA Museum of Contemporary Native Art exhibition, The Moving Land, 60-plus years of art by Linda, I can never say that name. Thank you, Lamahatua. Thank you, it's so beautiful. And the co-curation of the traveling exhibition, Action, Extraction, Redefined. Candice Hopkins is a citizen of the Carcross Tagish First Nation. She's the executive director and chief curator of Ford's Project and a fellow in Indigenous art history and curatorial studies at Bard College. She's the curator of the acclaimed exhibition Indian Theater, Native Performance Art and Self-Determination since 1969, which was at the Hessel Museum of Art, as well as touring exhibitions including Soundings, an exhibition in 5 parts co-curated with Dylan Robinson. Her new book, much anticipated, Native Visual Sovereignty, A Reader on Art and Performance, will be released in December. Dr. Jami Powell, our third speaker, is a citizen of the Osage Nation and a curator of Indigenous art and associate director of curatorial affairs at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth College. Prior to that, she was faculty lecturer in the American Studies program at Tufts University. Recently, she co-edited with Michael Hartman the book Re-Envisioning Histories of American Art, Transforming Museum Practice, which was released this year. She recently curated Cara Romero's first solo exhibition entitled Cara Romero, Living Light. Now, so for tonight's panel, we've asked the speakers to each give a presentation for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then it will be followed by a roundtable discussion between our 3 speakers. After that, of course, we'll have a Q&A followed by a reception. But before commencing tonight's event, I wanted to let folks know that next Wednesday, we'll be hosting Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Natalie Diaz here at the museum, also as part of the Indigenous Identities program. So hope you can join us for that as well. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest.
everyone. Thanks to the Zimmerli for inviting us here. I'm so excited when I heard that Jami and Lara were going to be part of this panel, so it's rare that we get to share the stage, and I'm grateful for it. I want to share about this most recent exhibition that Lara introduced. It's called Indian Theater, Native Art, Performance, and Self-Determination since 1969. And the reason that I want to use it as a kind of guidepost for us is because it reflects my current thinking on Native curatorial practice, also addressing what I see are some needs in the field, and also a need for research-driven scholarly exhibitions that share an art history. So it begins here. It begins with this document that I was introduced to when I was a curator at the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe. That's a part of the Institute of American Indian Arts, where I also first met Lara. It was a document that I think for a long time had been sitting very quietly in the archives. It had been sitting quietly because it was authored in 1969. So 1969 wasn't that long after I had started. And the people who co-authored this document were Lloyd Kivanu, who was the first president, who was also Cherokee, an amazing textile artist, fashion designer, and visionary, and Roland Meinholz, who was brought to IAI to lead the dance, theater, and drama department. And they worked very closely with students. This is the first document to try to define what contemporary Native theater and performance was and is now. So it's pretty extraordinary for that. And it was the basis for this exhibition, Indian Theater. And when I was thinking about this document and what it was proposing to do, I was thinking, well, what was in the air in 1969? What was in the air that led them to create this document in July of '69? And what was in the air was self-determination. So there was another formative event in 1969, and that was the occupation of Alcatraz by the self-named Indians of all tribes. Their first attempt to occupy the island was on November 9th, 1969, and they were plucked out of the currents, and they were wearing jean jackets, cowboy boots, and jeans by Coast Guard. And then when they got back to the mainland on the shores of San Francisco Bay, they quickly declared that their next action was not to occupy Alcatraz Island and not to claim it under Lakota Treaty from the late 1800s that declared all federal surplus land, essentially native land or Indian land, under that law. So then, a little over a week later, under the cover of night and having another ship captain as a compatriot, they did occupy Alcatraz Island, and they did so for 72 months successfully. That rapidly ushered in the self-determination era. It ushered in what Vine Deloria Jr., who was writing at the time, almost in real time of the occupation, both as an ally and a critic. It ushered in Red Power. So I was thinking about these two formative moments, these two formative documents, let's say, because when the Indians of all tribes occupied Alcatraz Island, they also created a document. So their document was called A Proclamation to the Great White Father, without any lack of irony. And in their document, they proposed to create, and this is one of my favorite parts of that declaration, the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs, which I think is a pretty good idea, especially today, run by Native people, was going to be their kind of oversight committee on Native and colonial relations. So what was interesting to me was this was obviously in the air, but this was obviously in the air as well for Lloyd Keevaneu, and these are two of his paintings that open the exhibition. And this idea of self-determination and, let's say, visual or performative sovereignty as a kind of tool and a strategy was and is an undercurrent of this exhibition. And this exhibition toured to the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina, Saskatchewan, and will close its tour at Site Santa Fe in the summer of 2026. So what you're seeing here is the theater that Lloyd Keevaneu commissioned the visionary designer Paolo Soleri to create for them, also just opened late in 1969. And here you have one of the kind of declarations and documents for the Indians of all tribes when they occupied Alcatraz Island. And anyone who's been there sees that this tag is still there. I could just keep holding it. Yeah. This is John Trudell, who started Radio Free Alcatraz on the island. It was a daily radio show, and I give that radio show credit for really creating a lot of public knowledge of the conditions that many Native people were living in and under, especially on reservation. And one of the things that they declared, also without a kind of hint of irony, was that their reason for occupying Alcatraz Island was also because it shared a lot of the same similarities to a lot of reservations. One of it is a lack of good housing, a lack of plumbing, a lack of clean water, a lack of basic infrastructure, a lack of certain kinds of economies. So with this idea of self-determination as its basis, I was thinking and looking at different theater groups, including Spider Woman Theater, that started in the early 1970s, so right after this document was created, as well as the ways in which performance artists have always used the agency in their bodies, let's say, to speak back to stereotype. And the exhibition then is a kind of survey of performance, of agency, of self-determination, and as well as sovereignty, and the way that this comes forward in art, not just performance, but also visual art, and the way that it's carried through today. So I know we just have a short time for an overview. So these are some more images of this exhibition. But importantly with this exhibition, it had to be engaged with and it had to be performed. And not just at the opening, not just at the closing, but at these kind of moments of, let's say, like clusters of action and agency. Many of the artworks changed over time as they were engaged with. Because it's a kind of curatorial methodology, I was asking the question of how the exhibition itself has the agency to also shift and transform and change and be engaged with. This is Eric Paul Reach with these are soft sculptures that are jewelry that are the size for the gods, for the Dene gods. And the way that the exhibition closes is with a kind of turn to how artists are engaging with actions of sovereignty now. So this is a beaded caution tape, and the way that I framed it is as though a tape for if you need to cordon something off because there's been land rights violations, and Nico liked that, so that's why we rolled it up like that, so it could be unrolled. As well as with mirror shields that were used at Standing Rock by a workshop that the artist Chanukka Hansko-Luger had engaged with. And then this large-scale intervention on the outside of the museum at the Hessel by Rebecca Belmore, which is marking it with an X. And then this work by Dimian Deneyage was on 24/7, and I think it's even more pertinent a message now. So thank you.
Hello, everyone.
I'm going to use this opportunity to shamelessly plug not one but two books. And if I had a title for this talk, it would be actually from a conversation in this book, but a conversation I've had with many colleagues about this metaphor of wanting a pie, wanting a part of the pie and our own pie too. And so I'm going to talk about two recent projects that incorporate Native art into the canon of American art and how that can happen within spaces, but also the importance of solo exhibitions, inspired actually by John Smith and a conversation we had when I first started in my role at the Hood Museum almost 8 years ago now. So this is an exhibition called This Land, American Engagement with the Natural World, and it was the first time that the Hood Museum had placed its Native American and American collections in dialogue with one another. And we did so thematically. I'm not trained as an art historian, I'm trained as an anthropologist. And so when I first began in the museum, I often felt intimidated that I didn't know the references people were making. But I quickly realized that it meant that I didn't carry the baggage of expectation that my fellow curators carried with them. As an anthropologist, I carried a different set of also problematic colonial baggage. But, you know, this installation here, there's an Acoma Oya or water jar with a rainbow and a bird, as well as an Audubon print of a bird and a Walton Ford print of a bird. So from 3 different time periods, 3 different artists, all engaging with birds in different ways. And so this was kind of the starting point for the exhibition and thinking about how is it that we bring the natural world into our artwork, into our aesthetics, and actually into the way that we transmit knowledge. As humans, we are much more visually inclined, and so that's why we have this saying that we've all heard that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so these images stick with us, and I'm excited actually in the dialogue. I hope we can talk more about visual sovereignty and self-determination and the power that images play in that work. And so one of the strategies we used in this exhibition was to actually play with the way that we display these works and to elevate some of the 3D objects that we normally place in cases in the round, in the center of the galleries, and to create mounts to show them on the same viewing plane as, for instance, a still life by one of the Peels, Peter Charles or John. And then there's this tea set by Daniel, or that was owned by Daniel Webster, who has a connection to Dartmouth. And the handles of the tea set actually have these leaves that kind of wind up the handles in a very similar way that the leaves go around the handle of this bandolier bag. And so we're often like thinking about the differences between different artistic forms and different ways of, you know, engaging culturally with material. But there's also this like shared human desire to bring the natural world into our homes through decorative art or into our fashion through the things that we wear. And so kind of placing those objects in conversation with one another and not even talking about it in the labels, people just kind of get it in a way that was really, I think, surprising and refreshing for a lot of us to see that, you know, people were having these conversations because, you know, no one really reads labels when they come to museums. We had this installation on sustenance, and we had this jug by Dave the Potter, an enslaved potter from who was in South Carolina, alongside duck decoys by a living Paiute artist, water basket, but also above these prints on the left-hand side, we have a Gwich'in gun case. And so thinking about, you know, placing works in conversation and the kinds of exhibition strategies we can use to encourage conversation. And I'd love to use this opportunity to shout out to the amazing preparators who do the incredible work that allows us to sit up here and yap at people. one of my favorite pairings in the show was this Lauren Harris with the Truman Lowe piece above it. And so it also enabled us to talk about kind of boundaries as something that transgressed Indigenous peoples and that are arbitrary and created. And so, Lauren Harris, a well-known Canadian landscape artist, and Truman Lowe, a Ho-Chunk artist, who was working in paper, both of them, looking at the Great Lakes, engaging with that place and the materiality of that place. But, having works that are different, but they speak so well to one another that you could see actually a conversation emerging between these two pieces, even though these artists likely never met. Or actually never met, that. Oh, Michael, you're in this. This is the last section of the show that was on reimagining American landscapes and featured works by Faith Ringgold, Arthur Amiot, and Michael Nemingha that shaped acrylic mounted photograph in the center where he actually used a drone to take this photograph, plays with the perspective, and actually imposed the colors that you see in the skyline from a map of methane gas pollution, which sit over this region of New Mexico where the photograph was taken. And so thinking kind of about like the hauntingly beautiful nature of some of this imagery and, using landscape as this American art form to actually question the ways we're impacting that landscape today. Hard right turn to a solo artist. So when I first started at the Hood Museum, I actually wanted to do a show of Cara Romero, or of Jean Quick-to-See Smith. At the time, it wasn't publicly known that she was working on a show with the Whitney. And I started talking to Jean and, said, okay, well, I'll approach another artist. She goes, can I encourage you to approach someone who's not in their 80s? And I said, that's a great idea. And we had conversations about, how, previous to her, Kay Walking Stick had a solo retrospective that traveled, and then there was Jean. And there's been more in the past couple of years, but really, both Kay and Jean were in their 80s before they had the opportunity to have a solo show. And so I had already formed a working relationship with Cara and saw the potential for her work, especially in a place like New England, where there's a lot of erasure, yet omnipresence in a weird way of Native peoples through like place names and things like that. But to have photography be something that had like a generous entry point for mainstream visitors or visitors who may not otherwise know anything about contemporary Native art. So, working with her on this show taught me a lot about her as a person, but also the value of really going deep into one person's story and one person's narrative. A lot of students that I interact with at Dartmouth and elsewhere, I think, want to try and speak to all of these issues that our communities are facing or that the world is facing, and they want to speak to everyone, and they want to, have this big message. And I think that actually limits the conversation they're able to have. And what Cara does really well is goes deep with one image to tell a very personal story, either about her own community. The first gallery was all images from her community, or to work with individuals to tell stories that are particular to their community or their personal narrative. And so going deep like that and personal allows for people to have a point of connection and a point of entry into dialogue for the work. I will say I was a little bit nervous about having this show. It was about half of the museum real estate, and I know what it is like to walk into a museum and to not see yourself represented. and to see, gallery after gallery of white dudes on horses. And I was, it's just not something I can relate to, except for the horse part. I grew up around horses. But having, going into that space and not feeling like I can see myself in those images or imagine possible futures, I was worried about how the majority of our audience at Dartmouth would interact with these images. Would they feel welcome into the space? Would they feel like they didn't have a place in the show? And that was not the case. We had really wonderful interactions with people who were interested in the work, but who also, had an affinity for something like boxing or roller derby or ballet. We had lots of young girls who really enjoyed sitting in front of the image of cricket tiger there on the beach in California in this beautiful ballet outfit that was made by Leah Matafragua. This section was on empowering women. This section was on environmental racism. And so thinking about the connections between extractive capitalism and extraction of resources and its impacts, particularly in California, but also for other communities. The connection to water as well. And then the last section was on ancestral futures and thinking about how looking to the past can help us find direction as we try to solve these global problems that we as all humans are facing, and how centering Indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world could actually help all of us and not be something that is specific to Indigenous communities, but something, if done correctly and not in an extractive way, can help all of us move forward.
OCO, hello everyone. Something that Jami just said I thought was really applicable to this exhibition too. The concern that what if people come into the exhibition and don't see themselves represented. So I was approached back in 2022 or maybe it was late or mid-2021 for an exhibition that was to be held at the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Renwick Gallery, which is a craft museum, American craft. It's part of the Smithsonian Museums. And I'm really honored to have at least two people here who actually worked on the exhibition. Smithsonian exhibitions take an army of culture workers, and I'm just happy to see them here too. So this is the Renwick Invitational. Is every few years, it's an invitational exhibition for American craft artists. And the museum administration had realized that they had never included Native American art in any way in any of their invitational exhibitions. So the idea was that they would have an exhibition of all Native artists to try to make up for that. And then I was part of the jurying process, and then there was a change of personnel, and they needed a curator, and they invented something they hadn't done before, which is they brought on a full contract curator. So normally it's a Smithsonian employee who takes the lead curatorial role on an exhibition like this, but they got creative, and they brought me on board to curate this exhibition. And these are the 6 artists who are in the exhibition. And if you can go back to this here. So the title, the concept, is how we approached being inclusive. So it is a Native exhibition. But thematically, we were looking at the artist's work and like, okay, what are some things that we have overlapping between each of the artist's work? What are some themes that we're seeing? And then what are some avenues for the audience to enter
into this work, even if they know nothing or very little about Native people. So we've worked on these concepts, and from talking to the artists, ideas about what is an honor, what is a burden, and in our Native traditions, being honored also bears responsibility. It's not like, oh, I've been honored with an award, yay me. In our communities, being honored means you now have a responsibility going forward. So it's not a like, oh, here's your achievement. It's you have achieved this, and now we have expectations that we're setting out for you. But then we were also thinking very deeply about what are the burdens that maybe are not honors that we also carry, and working through those ideas with works in the exhibition. These are by Maggie Thompson, and the equivocator is about burdens of love within a relationship, gaslighting, a feeling in your body when someone is lying to you. The work on the right, on loving, is a series of body bags. They don't look like body bags because they're so beautiful. She made her first one prior to this series as part of the mourning of her father, when she saw him being put into a body bag that was black and ugly, and it felt like it did violence to her. So as we were going through the pandemic and experiencing loss, and everyone's ways of grieving had been interrupted, she wanted to create body bags that were beautiful, that could help us recognize our collective unaddressed grief in a way that's very beautiful. But we did really worry about the first place that you walk into, the first works that you see when you enter the exhibition are these body bags. And ideologically, this was a red flag for the museum administration. And we really had to work hard to convince them, like, no, these are beautiful. When people walk in, they're not going to think body bag. They're going to think, wow, this is beautiful. I'm curious. I want to get closer. So here's a... fastest 5 minutes ever. I think I set that on. Okay. So I'm going to keep going really fast. Jill Feddersen, glass printmaking, really beautiful work about the visual shorthand, the symbols, telling stories with symbols. So these are all of the beasts of his region, but they also include the other things that you see, trucks and such, bicycles. Erica Lord, so her work I thought was really beautiful in terms of addressing some of the burdens. And in her case, she was talking about the genetic burdens of disease. And then she's transformed them into dog blankets, into burden straps. And works in this exhibition really helped people connect to one another. They saw people, they saw issues that they also experienced. There are a lot of cancer survivors, people who have lost people in their family. The diseases that she focuses on are ones that are primarily are very prevalent in Native communities, especially for Alaska Native community. So it's taking these disease burdens and transforming them into beautiful objects that are also historically used objects in her community, and in some cases they're experiencing a lot of revival, like dog blankets, these tuppies. And Lily Hope and Ursula Hudson are sisters. They're Tlingit weavers. And for the exhibition opening, we had protocol dancers from her community fly in and actually wear some of the garments, some of the regalia, so that people could see them, how they were meant to be seen, which is on a person being part of community. And oh my gosh, the paperwork that we had to do and the negotiations to make that possible, because it's oftentimes not permitted to actually wear things that are in museum permanent collections. And Geo Neptune, a fantastic Passamaquoddy basket weaver and sculptor with basketry. And this is some of the interactives. And I still occasionally run into people who talk about this exhibition without knowing that I curated it. And I hear the most amazing stories. That, for example, I was at a bar having a late dinner in D.C., and a young woman sitting next to me, a young black woman, was telling me about this exhibition she went to that she brought her mom and her sister to see, and they cried together. They could see themselves. They could see the ideas about honors, about burdens, how it related to their own lives, and it got them talking about things that they had never talked about before. And that's the gift that I see happening with art exhibitions. It's a way to bring people together. But it's only a part of the work that I do. So teaching college, which I did for 18 years, but also building infrastructure for the arts, which I think we're all going to talk about together a bit too, and crossing disciplinary boundaries, as Jami talked about, as with anthropology background. When I got my PhD in Native American art history, when I tried to get my PhD in Native American art history, applying to programs, I applied to one Ivy League, and my application was sent to the anthropology department without consulting with me first. They weren't willing to take me into an art history PhD program if what I wanted to study was Native American art. And so we're talking 1997, so a lot has changed since then, but that's also quite recent. And I was talking about Candice's discussion about the art historical narrative that's still forming, and that means we have a chance to create it now.
Who's going to start?
Well, I have a question, so I will start, but by deflecting to you all. I'm wondering if you two have had this argument that I've had with people, most especially my grandfather. Love him. He's taught me a lot, but, we used to get in arguments when I was working on my PhD. At one point he really wanted me to go to law school to do something useful. And, would say, we have bigger problems to address. And then that came up again during my graduate research when I was talking about visual sovereignty, and someone on my committee said, no, everyone else has just political sovereignty. Don't diminish our sovereignty by saying it's visual. Sovereignty is this one thing. And, we went back and forth on that a lot. Have you had to have those arguments with people?
With my family?
Or, we don't have to get into that, but,
Yeah.
Why is visual sovereignty important from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think it was in 1994, Jolene Ricard, and it's in this book. This is the reader that emerged from the Indian Theater exhibition. It's a reader, and it's 560 pages because I wanted to make that argument. Number one, that visual sovereignty is important, but that we have a long history of practicing it. And it's one kind of sovereignty of various sovereignties, right? And in that essay in 1994 that Jolene published called Sovereignty, A Line in the Sand, what she was talking about was an art history that was forming at that time. So she was part of a photo collective with a lot of other amazing artists, and they were talking about the fact that what they were doing, their photographs, were a form of sovereignty, and a very particular form of sovereignty. So Jolene wrote that essay as a way of talking about that, but also talking about the kind of inherent agency that is a part of images. And what she said is that, and she comes from Tuscarora Nation. Her family has been deeply involved in not only the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but Tuscarora sovereignty. And she made the case in that essay that digital sovereignty is not only a kind of sovereignty, but what we need to think about is actually beyond the bounds of legal sovereignty as an extension of it, not as a taking away of, let's say, tribal sovereignty, but as an extension of it. We've learned from these forms, and they manifest in different ways. So at the conclusion of this book, what I talk about is the fact that what is being enacted here is also a sense of performing sovereignty. And I think sovereignty is always evolving, it's always shifting, and we have these various ways in which it's enacted.
I completely agree, and I add to that as well that by parsing those things out into separate things, political sovereignty, legal sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, one of the things is there's a fundamental difference of understanding of what the arts are and what the arts do in Native communities, Indigenous communities, which is quite different from the Western idea of art, maybe like art with a capital A, but that, and it also has to do maybe with capitalism too, but there's so much of Native art that isn't meant to be for monetary exchange. It's for building our cultural fabric. It's for building relationships with one another. And I think that the arts can also serve that function in the art with a capital A. We're just not used to talking about it that way. I think Native art is one of the ways of making that visible, of making people aware of that, but it's also part of the establishment of Native rights to show people who we are, what's important to us. But our arts are also part of the intellectual practice. It's our philosophy. It's embodied in objects. It's embodied in the way they're exchanged amongst each other, amongst our separate communities, amongst our neighbors, amongst our non-Native neighbors. So the arts are part of the glue, the building of culture, relationships, and to separate that from political sovereignty is a fundamental misunderstanding of all those relationships.
Yeah, I'll give an example. I'm glad that you said that, Lara. I've always been inspired by this line that came forward during the land claim negotiations in Canada, in British Columbia, with the Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en people, where they put forward this idea that it's shared among coastal nations, this idea that a strict law bids us dance. It's a very complex idea. What it means is that dance is also a legal formation. And when the Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en land claim was being argued in provincial court, and then it went to the Supreme Court of Canada, they were able to successfully show not only that their dances are a form of sovereignty, so are their oral histories as a form of capital H history, but it was really the oration, songs, and dance that they used as evidence of territorial sovereignty. So that's how they're obviously deeply related, and there's the dancer with the with the trinket robe in Lara's presentation. So I wanted to share that. So they're not separate.
Yeah, and I think we're in a different moment now. Like, things really have changed and not changed in the last decade. But I think about, I have two boys. They're 9 and 13, and they're growing up in a world where the conversation on mascots is very different from what it was when we were growing up. And so one of the conversations, I had with my grandpa was about mascots and, the visual power of mascots or of images like Pocahontas, the Lone Ranger, and Tonto, the Chief Wahoo, these images, if those are the images people see or have in their minds of Native people, when we take our, cases to court, or when we go to speak to our legislators or, the lawmakers about, our concerns and our issues, they're not seeing us as human. They're seeing us as these caricatures. And, these are histories that these artists know deeply, and they're presenting them in ways that are really accessible to us, like Rebecca Belmore with painting the X on the side of that building, right? That is a particular reference to the signing of treaty documents with an X for people, who were put in a position to, sign away land without understanding what they were signing. And so that history is embedded within this art, and Native people coming into these exhibits, not all, but a lot of Native folks know this history, but the mainstream audience doesn't necessarily know it. I asked about reading labels, or I claim that no one reads labels. I work in museums and I have a hard time. I always take pictures and go back and read them after, but museum fatigue is a real thing and I get overstimulated. How do you convey these really complex ideas and help interpret them for audiences, or do you really rely on the artists?
I like video as a curatorial tool as part of exhibitions, and I started accidentally because I was teaching Native art history to Native students, and I would run into an artist I'm showing my students this short documentary about your work next week, and every single time the artist would say, "No, please don't show that to them. They got this wrong. I'm embarrassed. I especially can't have Native students seeing that." So that led me to start working with filmmakers in commissioning documentary shorts about Native artists, and then ending them up in exhibitions like the Cara Romero documentary, which I think you had in that exhibition too. So I have to admit, probably more people have seen the Cara Romero documentary, Cara Romero Following the Light, than have ever read anything that I've ever written. But I'm also proud of that, though. So I think I like having the artist's own voice in a format that lasts a long time. You can still see that on PBS if you want to. And then for the Sharing Honors and Burdens, I also executive produced a series of 6 documentary shorts about each of the artists. So I think exhibitions I think we need every single kind of tool in the toolbox, whether it's exhibitions, publications, labels, artist talks, documentary film. So more stuff? What other stuff do we do? Let's do more.
Yeah, I think about this question a lot, and we were talking about it earlier, this idea that, we are often making exhibitions sometimes for audiences that don't know the artist's work intimately, that they might not necessarily know the topic intimately. Number one, I think it's really important to think of one of the amazing things that exhibitions can do is to be embodied experiences. So I like to try as much as possible to captivate people, to use that as a way. And then I agree, Jami, sometimes education doesn't happen with a longer list of facts. Actually, sometimes people don't even want to engage if they think that that's going to be a kind of burden. So I think of education. How do we make education a space of generosity, a space of invitation? So for what we did as part of Indian Theater was use the one, as a way to foreground artist voices, two, as a place to tell stories, and then on every bench, I just put lots and lots of books, and people spent a lot of time with those books because I wanted, without having to state it, to share that we have various kinds of art histories. We have all of these monographic and exhibitions, all these retrospectives, all these PhD dissertations. We had one PhD dissertation there. And I wanted to show our knowledge as a kind of, almost like a mass, right? And I thought that that was really, really important because one of the things that I'm concerned with is if we simply use an exhibition as a way to speak back to other people's stereotypes or misrepresentations or ignorance of Native people, we're kind of in a trap. I think we need to instead speak from a place of abundance, speak to us as our own audiences, because we are, speak to Native artists as part of this audience, and not speak directly to that ignorance, because if we do, it gives them power. I don't know if you agree, that's just my strategy.
No, I think, when I was, in school, decolonizing was, the framework that was, and it still is, very popular, and I think is certainly important and opened up space, but it still centers the colonial. And so I've been thinking, a lot of my practice about like indigenizing or like centering Indigenous ways of knowing and being within the work that I do. And there's an inherent generosity in that. And that it's not limiting, that you're not, always speaking against. It also becomes this very exhausting exercise of, feeling like you're pushing this boulder up a hill, and it's always on the verge of rolling back. And so, how do we, and because there is this inherent generosity, I think there's this fear that comes from a place of ignorance that, if we're allowed to tell these stories or be in these spaces, that there will just be this reversal of the status quo, and that people will be made to feel unwelcome, or like it's not a place for them, or that they're less than, or that by doing this, that they will be dehumanized in the same way that we have been. But that's not the case. That, if me working from, a place of being an Osage curator, when people come to our homes as Osage people, we invite them in, we make sure they're fed, that they're clothed, that they have what they need, that they're comfortable. And that is like at the core of the ethos for the curatorial practice I engage in, and I know, you all do too, because that generosity is core to how we exist in relation to one another, and to the people with whom we interact.
Yeah, exactly. So we had a bit of a I think like a gritty question that I wanted to talk about, and that question is, I think one of the traps of the Native Group Show. I remember this was quite a long time ago. I was working as a guest curator on an exhibition that originated at Crystal Bridges Museum. It was called Art for a New Understanding, and we gathered together a group of experts. One of those experts was Kathleen Ashnelby, who's curator at Portland Art Museum now for many, many years. She was at National Museum of American Indian, and she said something that was really astute. She said, what I worry about of these kinds of surveys of contemporary Native art is, one, we have had a lot of them, and number two, it actually enables us to not have an art history, because it feels like we're in a state of perpetually introducing ourselves. And I thought that was really perceptive, and it is absolutely a bit of a trap. And I would say one of the other traps is that often people, as a way of dismissing the work that we do in exhibitions, just presume that the Native group exhibition exists because it's about identity. So I wanted to dig into that, because I know you both have opinions. I have opinions too.
I'm really over shows about identity and representation. It's just, if the work is on view, representation's covered, we don't have to talk about it. And I think it is this trap, or this space of limitation. a reservation, if you will, of, that we're not allowed to leave the boundaries of this conversation, because once we do, we will discover, or people will discover that, there is interest here. There is, something relevant. We're in a moment now. In years past, there's been kind of ebbs and flows of interest in Native art. And it is being sustained now, and I think that's because there's more Indigenous curators in the field. I think the market has a lot to do with it, for better or worse. Capitalism is certainly playing a role in that. But it also is because people are interested in what these artists have to say, in the stories that come from the communities that are being shared, in the value of these ways of knowing for solving, or giving us insight into ways we might solve global issues.
I think there's also the exhibition is kind of, I hate the tip of the iceberg kind of metaphor, but it's probably more Native scholarship, original Native scholarship by Native scholars is produced as part of exhibitions, because of lack of other arts infrastructure or lack of inclusion in the rest of the arts infrastructure in terms of whether it's retrospectives or tableau reliefs, documentary film, like the underrepresentation in scholarly journals. Those kinds of things means that those exhibition catalogs end up being the primary place for publication of original scholarship about Native art, especially by Native scholars as well. But then it leads to this whole knock-off effect on an economy that also ties in with commissions of new works, purchases by the museums, artisan residencies, public events like this. So it helps build this whole economy of interrelated parts. And then Forbes comes in and starts producing new ways of filling the holes, and not just filling the holes in the Western art sense, but creating new ways of being in the arts, new ways of supporting artists and scholars. The Research Center for Contemporary Native Arts also, so instead of being decolonial, it's indigenizing. It's creating new forms of support for artists and scholars that are based on Indigenous models.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I have this fear sometimes that, our work exists within that particular canon that doesn't always influence some of the other canons outside, let's say, or the broader canon of art history. And what I tried to do pre-Forge and still sometimes try to do is use the leverage of what we can call the recurrent international exhibitions, so biennials, or as part of the work that I did for Documenta, a quinquennial, so mouthful. It just means an exhibition that takes place every 5 years, to bring not only Indigenous artists, but other artists who I felt like were super important but didn't have a big enough platform, and to really invest in the production of major new works, and then to leverage that international platform to put pressure on, in some cases, national museums in their home country. So one example I've been thinking about just today is the Sami artist who's originally from Sapmi in northern Sweden, Britta Marakatlaba. We worked together as part of Documenta 14. And I remember when we, during the opening day, when we unveiled her work, Historia, which is an epic, 24-meter long, single embroidered piece that she made over 5-7 years.
I saw that piece. It was amazing.
It is amazing. And I remember there was a curator there from a museum in Stockholm, Sweden, who had never heard of Britta. And just this last year, she's had her first major retrospective exhibition in her home country. And I think for Native artists, this is one way. It's a kind of more rare kind of platform, I would say. But it's been really important to also show how their work is talking about, like for the artist Bodic, it's part of Documenta. It's talking about other forms of ideas of wealth or economy. And I think as much as possible, we need more of these platforms to leverage that as well so that they can start changing these other canons of art too.
And I'm seeing that even in the art funding world that I work in with First Peoples Fund, which working with mainstream art funders, we're starting to see some of the language that we've been using for a long time. It's not just artists, but artists and culture bearers. That language is moving into the art funding realm as well. So you'll see this term culture bearers, but it's coming from Indigenous arts funders, arts communities, and we're successfully, shifting some ideas about what art is, what art does. Maybe we're indigenizing things a little bit.
Well, I think you bring up an interesting point that the Western definition of art is very limiting, and I think one of the things that Indigenous art histories has to offer to the broader art world, certainly within American and European context, is that art serves lots of purposes. Like the idea that art for art's sake is what we should be focusing on, really limits the possibilities of how we can interact with art. That like art is an educational tool. It is something that makes us feel emotions. That serves as a mnemonic device or passing down oral histories. That has an important role in ceremony across the world, right? Think about like all the beautiful art that was created, for the Catholic Church, right? That like that is ceremonial and spiritual, and it's about educating, and it's also about, as it is in our communities, about social control in a way too. That there are all of these functions that art serves, and by placing it, in this context of like Western art history, we're actually not able to unpack all that complexity, and we're limiting the dialogue we're able to have.
Yeah, you're totally right. I'm so happy that you said that, because I say the same thing all the time. I think that one of the things that this work does is it challenges the very narrow definition of contemporary art. It actually has a narrow definition, and I want to share a story because it was exactly this. I was part of this group, this kind of closed door curatorial forum in this art fair called Arco that was in Madrid, and I was really thinking about this is when I first thought that I might want to work with the late Kwakwaka'wakw artist Bodic, and I was fascinated by this intervention he did in his commercial gallery. This is in 2012, where midway through the run of the show, he went inside the gallery. He took down, I think it was about 30 masks, and he took them with him, and he went back to his kind of adopted home community of Alert Bay, and some of them were danced. They're meant to be danced 4 times, these appliquing of these forest masks, and then after they've had 4 cycles of dance, they're burned. And they're burned because that enables the reciprocity that new ones get carved. And so that's how new, younger carvers learn how to not just carve the mask, but learn the stories, the songs, and the dance that come with those particular masks. Each one has a different one as part of telling this complex story of the forest masks. And I thought this is super interesting. Number one, because he's not allowing these to enter the gallery system because this is a commercial space. He's showing that they have a social life and an obligation that's outside of this space. Not only that, he invited his various gallerists that he would kind of work them against each other to witness the burning of the masks, as well as other artists. And so, this gathering was about new materialism, and when I presented and I showed my slides and everything, I talked about how excited I was about this because I felt like it challenged this kind of limited definitions of contemporary art, even performance. And the kind of curatorial intelligentsia, let's call them, some from Europe, they said to me, well, does Bodick audition his work? Did he make a video? Like, does he know about, I don't know, relational aesthetics or whatever? And I said, yeah, he knows the market really well. That's how he's been successful for all of his years. And then they agreed, and they talked back to me, and they said, well, we think his work is contemporaneous, but it's not contemporary art. So I took that as a challenge, and I think I won that battle, but it took me many years. But that was exactly the point that I was making, is like, how is this field that's supposed to be so boundaryless, how does it have such rigid definitions of art?
Well, the only thing that's new about new materialisms is that, academics in certain spaces are now talking about it. Those conversations have been happening in our communities for a really long time, and things like relational aesthetics are just something that are inherent knowledge to a lot of people. And, the idea that if you make a work, that part of who you are as a person is imbued in that work, like, that's not new. I hate new materialisms, but we can talk about that another time. Should we do questions? Okay, Brandon's saying we should do questions. We could continue to just chat amongst ourselves for probably another couple of hours, but
Clearly.
We might need some days sometime.
I don't think we need days.
Any questions? Oh, pleasure. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I'm thinking a lot about, so much of the work that you showed was about interaction with objects and spaces and how artists and performers activate the space, animate the space. I'm also curious, I know Lara showed like the interaction wall with visitors coming and interacting. So I want to hear more about like maybe who exhibitions are for, who you're thinking about as audiences as they come to the space, maybe as like expanding engagement.
much like Wu-Tang, my curatorial practice is for the children. I grew up, my father was in the Navy, we moved around a lot, and as like a military family, we got like free tickets to go to museums, and I would go, and my dad was stationed north of Chicago, and so I got to go to the Museum of Science and Industry, the Field Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, and I went into these places, and it wasn't the Art Institute of Chicago that was so exciting to me as a kid, but to go into the Field Museum and to like be able to crawl through this pyramid, which seemed huge at the time, like those were so exciting to me, and I was like, I want to be a paleontologist. I want to do this. So that excitement of like the possibilities for my future that I saw in these spaces, combined with the really terrible representations of Native people that I was also seeing in these spaces, was what made me want to do this work. And so if you'll go to the slide, the corn room in Kara's show, I think it's my last slide. I was thinking a lot about like immersive installations and the power of transforming people into a space, but also into a space where they could think differently than they might normally. And so here we have all of these cobs of corn suspended from the ceiling with filament, and it's recreating the photograph on the back wall, the zenith. Fun fact, that's actually George Alexander, who has a painting in this show. He was the model for that. So it was a way for us to show like Kara's process. So she actually hung these in her studio to take this picture, and then went in and edited the filament out. And then she also uses these gels on her lights to create the color. So the images that are really saturated on the right-hand side there are actually either the colored backdrops, and like the green on that image, Gikandaso, is from a gel that she's using. She didn't Photoshop that. And so we wanted to be able to talk about her process and these techniques she's using, but also to create this like futuristic, we were referring to it as like a futuristic seed bank. in space, and thinking about like how the act of creating an environment that is different from the kinds of spaces we experience in our daily lives can enable us to think differently about the world that we live in.
I'm getting a nod. That was really nice, Jami. I think that Laura, I was inspired by, your observation of even this term culture bearers becoming more in the mainstream in terms of support. But I think another shift that I've seen is this idea that, art is not simply art for many of us. Things that we bring into the space are beings very, very often. They need to be treated with respect. And there's certain protocols around them, even ones that were made yesterday. And first and foremost, I see an audience as the work itself, if it feels honored and respected, number one. Then I think that you create a kind of different energy in an exhibition. And I feel like as Native curators working in this space, we never have the privilege of thinking of the museum as neutral. No matter what we do, we always are kind of working with that either at the back or the foreground. But similar to Jami, I feel like it's a marker of success if people go into an exhibition and they have a sense of joy. But the biggest marker of success was there was an image before of Eric Paul Reach performing. We don't have to go back to it, but there was an amazing moment at the opening of Indian Theater where he was there with about 7 children, and the children didn't want to leave. So I think if the children don't want to leave, then you're starting to do your job well.
Go back to the dogs and the tippies, Laura. Because we've had a conversation before about these dogs and ordering the dogs and getting the dogs, and the dogs, it could have been cheesy. Like, that was a fear you had, I know.
Absolutely. Yes.
Sorry, but I was just wondering how you felt the dogs turned out.
They turned out well. I think they're evocative without stealing too much of the attention. But you can't really tell in this, but there is a dog sled at the very back, and each one of these dogs is wearing a different disease, and the disease that's closest to the dog sled is COVID. So it's a DNA, RNA, microarray analysis, so like one-to-one data. But these objects are archives of genetic data that this data probably will not be readable by computers in another 50 years. And even now, some of the research information has been removed from the internet. So these actual objects then become an archive of genetic information about disease specific to Native communities. So it's the burden of technology transformed into something sacred for community. But also, we were really worried that kids and people would try to sit on the dogs.
They are really touchable artworks, too. We have a work by Erica on view right now. It's DNA, RNA microanalysis of diabetes. It's actually a shawl that you wore to a film premiere at one point, I think.
Oh, yes.
It's so heavy.
My shoulders hurt. I think it weighs 28 pounds, something like that. Maybe.
But last summer, my boys and I spent a month, and my mom came with us in Santa Fe, and we got to go do a studio visit. And the boys, because we were in the artist studio, they were sitting there touching it. And we went into the gallery a couple weeks ago, and the work was on view. And my younger son goes, "Oh, I can't touch it anymore, can I?" He's like, "No, you can't." But it made me think of wanting to actually get, the next time we put it on view, to get some of those beads and to, have them woven into something so people can touch and interact, because that's how these objects were made to be seen, and you made that point with Ursula and Lily's pieces about, the fact that like movement and the sound they make and the way the designs move, or, when dancing, the way the fringe sways back and forth, that is part of what we're missing when we put these things into museums and put them on view.
I went to Gianni Whitehawk's exhibition a couple weeks ago, and I noticed that there are those touchable elements so that people can touch, busting fringe and beads. Great idea.
You just started to answer my question, but I was going to ask, one of the challenges, there's this categorization of contemporary art that leaves out the ways in which creative practices and creative expression that's part of community and lived practice is truncated, both by the idea of art for art's sake, but also by the practices of museums and galleries with these kinds of restrictions. So I was curious, experiments or ways that you've tried to extend the way that these cultural belongings or beings can be in these spaces that have these presumed categories, but maybe introduce other ideas about the way that we can live it and engage with different kinds of creative expression outside of those.
Yeah, one way that I tried to do was, and to go back to I don't know if anyone saw this work, but there's lots of images online of the installation with Bodic in Athens, Greece, as part of Documenta, an extraordinary installation of masks, both new ones called the Undersea World Kingdom, the forest masks, as well as Zenokwa, who's the cannibal woman mask. Actually, she's kind of shifts genders between male and female. And when I was working with Bo, he was really clear that the forest mask had an obligation to go back to his home community because he was organizing basically a super potlatch. And so there were needed to be danced. And we thought that the best way to facilitate that was to simply remove them from the stands, and so that when audiences came, they could witness the empty stands, but understand that the masks had a responsibility to be back home. So I think that's actually one way. How do we make it transparent? Because I think a lot of times when we show things in museums, there's still a kind of normalization of stripping the cultural responsibility of ancestral belongings or even contemporary belongings. And how do we actually make that part of the exhibition, to put it on view, instead of trying to pretend that that doesn't happen?
I think there's also a danger and a fear that I have in doing that of not making it a spectacle, right, with not making it about the performance or thinking that you're trying to engage in ceremony or, things that shouldn't be happening in the space, because I think there's this expectation of performing certain kinds of indigeneity within institutional spaces. And so that's one of the fears that that always kind of bubbles up to the surface for me when we engage in these kinds of activities. And so just making sure that it's, people from the communities or the artists themselves saying this is how this should be done, and never coming from a place of like, me as the curator, I think this is important for us to do, but really making sure it emerges like from community ways of knowing and protocol and directed by the artist.
So with everyone talking about capitalism and consumerism and like the new world with how people do not explore, see things as much, a lot of it's online from like ordering Amazon packages to your home, like VODs, videos, etc. What kind of future do you see with engaging and reaching more people and young kids and things like that? And is there like a line between art for capitalism for the benefit of engaging more people, or do you think maybe it would dilute the meaning and history behind it too much?
I think the greatest potential is in creating maybe new kinds of institutions, new kinds of practices. It's a challenge in this particular moment, but any time that people get together to make things together, regardless of what their cultural background is, that's like under capitalism, that's kind of a radical act. To make things is a radical act. To come together with other people is a radical act right now. And it doesn't necessarily take money. It takes time. It takes social connections. You might need a little bit of resources. But if we did that on bigger and bigger scales, if more communities had access to that, that makes a big culture shift. And especially if you start with young people, but it doesn't have to just be young people. First Peoples Fund has built an art space in Pine Ridge on the reservation, and it's the first of its kind there. And there's workshops regularly. 40, 50 people show up to whether it's a sewing night, or it's making star quilts, or it's a painting or printmaking workshop, or it's a drum group. People are coming together, we feed them, and that's how you change things. But that means, if you're going to do that at scale, you need to agree that it's important, and that it's important for all communities, and that it deserves to be funded. And that the goal is not necessarily to make professional art. The goal is to build community connections, to build cultural ties between people, to build healthy relationships with your friends, your neighbors, your families, and people who are visiting you from outside the community. I think if every community had those kinds of activities, I think we would be a lot happier.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think it's one that impacts the kind of quote-unquote art world in general, right? It's not just capitalism, but it's the speed at which it impacts our lives. We live in a time of arguably hyper-capitalism. And speaking from more like an institutional perspective or organizational perspective, we never call ourselves an institution at Forge. When Forge Project, which is the organization I help run, transitioned to be a nonprofit, we commissioned the collective New Red Order, who are part of this exhibition, to announce that transition. And they did it with a video that's called Forging Reciprocal Relations. And everything they do has biting humor, but the idea of reciprocal relations is real, and I think that we need to, as much as possible, think about reciprocity so that we avoid extraction. There's different kinds of colonialisms. One is extractive colonialism, and that operates on our land. It's how wealth, and I mean wealth from our communities, not in monetary sense, but our cultural wealth, was taken from us. But as part of that work of forging reciprocal relations, we think a lot about wealth redistribution. So we actually use our nonprofit as an avenue for wealth redistribution, as a way to talk plainly and honestly about the extreme, not only the extreme wealth that's been taken from our land and our communities, but the wealth disparity that impacts not just native cultural producers, but native communities in general. And I think unless we start having those kinds of honest conversations, we also can't think about how the economies of art can be more radical, or the economies of native art can be more radical and transparent.
I'll just add that, I think a lot of us have been, watching the government shut down and thinking about, people not having access to staff or, the resources they need, people not getting their paychecks and other things. And, I was recently having a conversation about going to Art Basel and doing those things, and I was like, it seems really weird to be planning this really expensive trip to go look at art and to be surrounded, like, in this space where, it costs dealers like a minimum of like $500,000 to go and set up a booth. in this space, like, at a time when people, like, don't have their basic needs met, right? And so I think that there's this, like, it can be helpful to, like, dissociate in our line of work, but it also, I think, like, knowing that that ambiguity exists in all of our lives, that many of us disagree with, you know, the things that we do daily, or know that we could do things differently and it would have an impact on the world, that, like, that we are constantly trying to, or perpetuating the structures that we're trying to tear down in our work, is something that I've just learned to be more and more comfortable with, and knowing that that's part of how things work. Because as much as I'd like to say, let's just burn it all down and start over, that's not actually a realistic solution. That, like, abolishing museums and, like, giving everything back is, you know, not actually the answer. That, you know, museums and these, you know, as civic institutions can be places where people can come together and, you know, kind of have dialogue across these, you know, across our differences, right? Instead of us having a conversation with one another, you know, that conversation is triangulated through a work of art and becomes less about, you know, us as people and more about what we're seeing. Or when you're making things, you know, when you're doing a sewing project in a group, your hands are busy, your mind's kind of busy, and the conversation goes in directions you might never imagine. And your guard kind of is let down in a way. And so art has a value for us to come together. And I think that's actually something that we really need right now, because, you know, we're really divided as people, as a nation. And, you know, there's this trope, speaking of tropes that I hate, walking in two worlds is the worst. Because there's one world, and we're all in it together, sadly. No. You know, Jeff Bezos can go away on his rocket, but, you know, the rest of us are stuck here. You know, and so this idea that, like, that we're in this together in reciprocity and dialogue, and, you know, that we don't always have to agree, and that's actually not healthy for us all to agree, and that technology perpetuates this by, you know, our algorithms, you know, giving us the things we want to see and comments from people who we do agree with. You know, the three of us here are having a conversation, and we're, like, agreeing with each other and things. But, like, what would happen if we had this conversation with people who disagree with us? Like, why don't we have those conversations publicly in these spaces? And I think that's kind of the challenge ahead of us, is to figure out how to enact that generosity with folks who maybe don't want to be generous toward us.
Well, I think we're running out of time, but we could continue for another hour if we wanted to. And please join me in thanking our really wonderful speakers. And join us for a reception in the back of the room. Thank you.